Now let's look at the simulation in more detail. The key dynamics that are going to elucidate our approach are XY yielding 4 scenario pathways approach, classic Royal Dutch shell methodology. The what question. We're going to ask, does China achieve escape velocity from the so-called middle income trap? Easy to get to the middle income level for developing economies. Hard to make that jump from middle income to high income, because that's where you hit that wall between extensive and intensive growth. And shifting from the former to the latter, very difficult. Or does China become old before it becomes rich, which is the clock that's running on China right now? Second, the how question. In either succeeding or failing on the first question, do we talk about China turning outward with more aggressiveness, a focus on military answers, or does it turn inward with more passivity and focus on political answers? Historically, China has leaned more to the latter. So when we take those two key questions, that's what gives us our master narrative approach. We'll draw a vertical axis, and we'll ask the question, does China achieve escape velocity? That's to the north. Or does China get old before it's rich? That's to the bottom. The key variable here on the vertical axis is China's ability to push through the necessary economic reforms and whether it can shift dramatically to domestic consumption-led growth. Now let's look at the horizontal axis. The questions here are, does China turn outward with aggression, or does it turn inward with passivity? Here, the key drivers is the evolving power relationship between the Chinese Communist Party and the People's Liberation Army, and how they interact over the hot-button issue of nationalism. Now let's name the 4 quadrants. If China gets old before it turns rich and turns inward with passivity, that one we're describing as sick man of Asia. Sick man comparing to post-bubble Japan in the 1990s and 2000s. So a modern replication of the problems that Japan has experienced since it hit its own demographic wall and was unable to shift into high-income growth as effectively as it sought to. Another version of China getting old before it gets rich, but turning outward in terms of aggression, that one we dubbed the poor man's Japan, referencing Imperial Japan's experience in the 1930s. If China achieves escape velocity and still turns outward with aggression, sort of the Pentagon's nightmare, that one we're describing as the angry man's Germany, i.e. Kaiserian Germany, pre-World War I. And for those of you who like that comparison of globalization now to pre-World War I, this is the key variable that drives that comparison, frankly, in terms of geostrategic concerns. Finally, the best scenario. China escapes the middle income trap, but turns inward with passivity, focuses on political answers. There, we're calling it the thinking man's South Korea. So looking at South Korea post its democratization process, or actually during its democratization process as well, because obviously China needs to move through that process if it's going to achieve that upper right quadrant. Now let's look at the individual scenarios in more details. First, the sick man's Japan, post-bubble. Various characteristics we're looking for here. Never escapes the copycatting of other people's technology, never really moves to new and real innovation. The financial sector remains very much state-dominated. The climbing of the production ladder is achieved in several industries, but not enough to really achieve escape velocity. Rising labor and environmental costs ramp up, and they create a certain impetus for job flight to Southeast and South Asia, and even to Africa. China is basically stuck with the DPRK, North Korea, when the rehabilitation comes due, and there are enormous costs with that. The regime is happy enough with achievements in terms of its growth and never really gets scared enough to go bold on reforms. The soft federalism that we see inside China gets even more pronounced, provinces doing more and more what they want, Beijing a little bit less control from the center. That leads to uneven development. A second Deng never really quite appears to push that reform process deep into the necessary territory. So we have, over time, kind of death by 1,000 Tiananmens and a crumbling dictatorship. Finally, as China ages, it grows too old for real change. So some of the details on the sick man's post-bubble Japan master narrative. Now let's look at the poor man's imperial Japan scenario. We see a similar decline, but a harder economic landing that triggers an embrace of Maoism and more statism. So sort of the threat we saw with Bo Xilai in Chongqing, recently defeated. It sticks to what it knows, it blames its decline on evil foreigners, and it denies, and it runs a narrative that basically argues the West is seeking to deny China its rightful place in the world and its rightful trajectory in terms of power and economic wealth. The best and brightest begin to emigrate in numbers, especially the rich. We've seen poll numbers, for example, that say half the millionaires in China would like to immigrate. We see the party seeking to grow and find more safety in a deeper dependence on the People's Liberation Army. We see the People's Liberation Army feeling boxed in by the US-led containment process. We see a national mood that says, in effect, sort of like America in the 1950s, better red than dead, better to stay red than to suffer the death or the dissolution of the system through rapid democratization, or even slow-term democratization. We see the demographic doom start to spread across society, creating a certain desperate sort of nationalism. And then we see resource reliance becoming sort of a strategic desperation, and China striking out, not unlike a Japan in the 1930s, fearing its access to energy and whatnot. Now let's look at the more dangerous situation in terms of China becomes rich and powerful and moves in the direction of antagonism with the outside world. The party never here loosens its grip. It reaches for the PLA more and more, and the two of them use nationalism to try to balance each other out in a dangerous sort of situation. So kind of a one-upping in terms of geostrategic risk-taking. The economic miracle does continue, though, via growing dominance by China over an expanding South-South trade and investment situation. We see the moribund West offering no real competition to China in global markets, and especially in emerging markets in the South. We see a shift to domestic consumption-led growth successfully achieved. We see China embracing its own myth of exceptionalism, like the United States. We see democracy successfully held off, and a certain hubris accumulating because China was told it couldn't get this rich without turning democratic. So we see it becoming more dynamic in terms of international security affairs, and over time, this is really, as I said earlier, the Pentagon's nightmare. China goes bad after it becomes rich. Finally, the best scenario, the thinking man's emerging South Korea. We see innovation and domestic-led growth succeed within China. We see, per the South Korean experience, China suffers a rather rapid onset, bottom-up demand for democracy at a certain point in the process. We see nationalism harnessed to self-improvement, not to a kind of a negative, xenophobic view of the world. We see a religious awakening because of all this economic churn, people being torn loose from their moral guideposts and turning to religion more and more, that becoming a positive force for self-improvement within the country and a positive form of nationalism, and basically moral ballast in this journey. We see the party adapting itself to the implied challenge of all these different changes and basically creating its own opposition preemptively. We see the long march to success finally consummated across the Chinese economy, but that creates the question within society, is this all there is to success? On that basis, the party responds by splitting itself increasingly along a range of answers to that essential question. What now? Now that we're rich, now that we're accomplished, now that China is powerful, what do we do with all these things? We see the party, in effect, splitting itself up, coming up with different answers, trying to create the competitive landscape that best moves China forward from that point in terms of its development. And then we see a true national confidence emerging when a kind of a new Nixon within the Chinese experience steps up and opens up China very dramatically for good to the outside world and starts to take a very proactive definition of what China's place in the world really is all about. So those are our four master narratives.